Welcome to the Touch MBA Admissions Podcast. Do you need help figuring out which schools to apply to or how to get into the world's top MBA programs? Hey, you're not alone. Join thousands of others on this podcast and on our site, touchmba.com, as they seek the admissions edge. And now, here's your host, Darren Joe.
What's up, guys? It's Darren, your host. Welcome to the Touch MBA podcast. What we do here on the show is give you an inside look into what the top business schools around the world are really like. And we bring on admissions directors and students and alumni. We interview them. We get them to share, what really makes their schools unique. And of course, how you can give yourself the best chance of getting in to these top business schools. We also offer free school selection help at touchmba.com. So if you're struggling this May, trying to figure out what your short list of business schools should be, and you need some expert guidance there, you can get some free profile feedback from us at touchmba.com. So this week is a really special episode. And I know that I say that many times to introduce these shows, but it truly is something different, something new, and something I'm really excited to present to you guys. It's the first time where we're going to have a guest host. So I actually met our guest host at the CBS Pre-MBA Bootcamp a couple years ago. And I was very impressed by the quality of his questions during the sample classes. And I also found out he was a huge Touch MBA fan, that he had listened to many episodes of the podcast. So we kept in touch after that pre-MBA CBS bootcamp. And, he came to our site to get some free profile feedback. And eventually he got into a great school. He got into the London Business School. When I was thinking about bringing on a guest host, he was actually the first person that came to mind because I knew he really believed in what we were trying to do with this podcast. I knew he was razor sharp, and he's also got a really unique background, and you'll hear about that soon. And I think that after recording, over 130 episodes of the show, as much as I love doing this, and I will still continue to do this, I think that the show and the audience, you guys, could really benefit from a new host, someone who could bring a new perspective to this show and a new type of energy and different types of questions. And when I heard this first episode that he recorded, it was a really strange feeling, to be honest, because I've always been on the other side of the microphone. And here I was listening to the first episode of the Touch MBA podcast that didn't have me as the host. So it was a really kind of surreal, strange feeling, but by the end of the interview, I was just really excited about this. I was so proud of this episode and what Matthias was able to do, but also just having this fresh new perspective on the show. I think you'll really enjoy it, and even though Matthias has a very different style than I do, it, like all the previous episodes, will give you an inside look into what the MBA is really about. So I proudly present to you the first guest host of the Touch MBA podcast, Matthias Keller.
My name is Matthias Keller. I am a current MBA student at the London Business School. And prior to starting my MBA here at LBS, I worked as a German diplomat in Bangladesh and in Afghanistan, focusing mostly on human rights and counterterrorism. And I really enjoyed my time in the Foreign Service, but I made a very conscious decision that I wanted to leave the public sector. It's a very bureaucratic sector, a very hierarchical sector. So I wanted to switch to the private sector, but I'm mostly interested in pursuing a career that is at the intersection of business and government, where I can really combine my deep knowledge of the public sector with what I learn here at the London Business School. And I remember that before applying, I was very much in your position. I tried to gather information online. I read a lot of online forums, and at some stage I found the Touch MBA podcast. And since then, I have become a regular listener. I think that Darren is doing an incredible job, and I've learned so much, and I found it extremely helpful to listen to the podcast. And that is pretty much the reason why I'm hosting a show as a guest host because, I'm so grateful to Darren for all the free information that he's putting out on the podcast. So I really wanted to give back, and I thought that this would be a great way to give back to the community. We are here today with Professor Randall Peterson from the London Business School. Welcome to the podcast, Professor Peterson. I will just give a brief introduction of your background for our listeners. You received your PhD in social psychology from the University of California, Berkeley. And then you worked for a bit at the Northwestern University and later at the Cornell Johnson School of Business. And now you're here at the London Business School, where you are the director of the Leadership Institute, where you also teach both MBAs and executives. And that is how I got to know you, because in the beginning of the MBA course, you're teaching a three-day intensive leadership course for first-year MBAs, where you really focus on giving information on how to lead organizations, but also on how to build high-performance teams. So the way that I would like to structure this episode is I would love to hear about your experience in the classroom. What are common factors or characteristics in MBA students that you believe are important for their success, both in business school and in their career? Then I would like to talk a bit about the importance of leadership in work and how to develop leadership skills. And lastly, I would really like to focus on your research specifically when it comes to both leaderships and building successful, diverse teams. Great. So that was the introduction. So why don't we start with the first thing about successful MBAs, right? Can you talk a bit about your experience? What makes a successful MBA student?
Right. Well, thank you for having me here. It's a real pleasure, honor to be here and to talk about this. I think what makes for a successful MBA depends a little bit on how you define success. The way I define a successful MBA is one who really takes full advantage of everything that's on offer in most any good business school. It's not just what's in the classroom. It's the opportunity to network, develop your set of relationships. The best students that I've been in touch with for 10, 15, in some cases 20 plus years are those who have a network of people that they started, or really built here. It's a global network of people. Whenever they're doing something, they want an outside perspective. They've got a list of people they can go to talk to, as well as being trained to think critically, really question everything. What's the actual data and information behind this? Why is that claim being made? It's not that you don't believe everything, but you search for what is kind of good evidence. So that's classroom, but it's also the opportunities to build and grow yourself and your interpersonal skills and your leadership skills. Because the other part of it is getting yourself engaged in the kind of activities that happen around the school. Like when I was a student, I enjoyed doing it. And I remember having classmates who were like, oh yeah, whatever. That's not the real world. It's kind of waste of your time. Just focus on it. And you know what? The stuff that I learned being active in student activities is exactly the same set of interpersonal skills you need to go to the workplace, to get your colleague down the hallway to work and cooperate with you on a project as well. So, I would say the successful MBA is also one who's kind of really fully engaged kind of with everything that's going on, that really broad array of stuff.
And are there some specific skills that you wish MBA students would have more, right? I mean, you already discussed the ability to think critically, to be curious, to go out and network. Are there maybe some characteristics that MBA students lack or are worse than the general population in?
Great question. Amongst the faculty, there's always discussion of these kind of things. You probably no doubt figure out. I think sometimes it's changing, but certainly when I first came, if it's all about the money, it's actually hard to be passionate and engaged over the long haul. The most successful entrepreneurs I know, the most successful business leaders I know, do it and do the work they do because they think it's interesting, engaging, you make a difference in the world. And it's not just about, I want to get rich. And if there's a stereotype that I think is changing, but, could continue to evolve, it's, you go to business schools, open up doors and make it, create opportunities for you to make money. But the most important thing is to open the doors to give you the opportunity to make a difference in the way you want to make it. So I would love MBAs to say, even more than they are doing these days, to say, I want to do something that's important, that's interesting, that I'm really passionate and engaged around.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that, and also that you compared it to how it was before, because my impression here at the London Business School is that a lot of students are very passionate about having a positive impact in their career. So, for instance, our Impact Club is one of the biggest clubs on campus. A lot of students are getting involved in the Impact Consulting Club, for instance, where they consult on a pro bono basis with non-profit organizations. So my perception is that, this whole topic of having a positive impact in your career and not only making money is getting a lot of traction here. But I think another thing that our listeners would be interested in is, as you know, our listeners consist of both current MBA students, but also applicants, right? Mm-hmm. And I remember when I came to the London Business School, I was very much anxious. I didn't really know what to expect. So do you have some recommendations for an incoming MBA, how to prepare for the classroom interaction? And maybe can you, in this context, also discuss how maybe the classroom interaction in business school is very different from interactions in normal universities, for instance, through the case study method?
Right. Excellent point. Yeah, the classroom discussion here. I'm trained as a social psychologist. My early teaching was in psychology and communication, kind of undergraduate teaching. And the teaching I do here is completely different. When I walk into the classroom, I assume you've had some experience in the world and that we're going to draw on that experience, because the best way to learn, my undergraduate degrees are actually in education. And what it shows, what the research shows there, the best way to learn is to take experience and to build on top of it, not to say start a whole new file drawer, dump it all here. And what I love about the MBA and the teaching I do here is that it's, okay, pull open a drawer you've already got started, let's add to it. And what the research shows and what I experience is that the students have a whole different type of learning and a whole different type of experience, because we're building on your experience and then we're adding to it with cases and examples. And the beauty of a place like London Business School is those examples are global. They come from all over the world. And if you can kind of get your head around the big ideas that work kind of across that whole classroom, you've got a handle on what works at the most fundamental level, most anywhere. We also talk about the regional differences, the national differences, the cultural differences, but there are other things that work no matter pretty much where you are. And those are exciting. It doesn't matter then where you are, what you're going to do. You set yourself up for a global career.
Yeah. And you mentioned that you're still in touch with a lot of your former students, right? And you've just described how important this diverse classroom interaction is. But how successful do you think management training and leadership training in general is when it comes to translating what you learn in the classroom to your actual career? Do you hear from former students, it sounded easier when you talked about it in classroom, but now that I'm in the real world, I face different problems? Or do you think that this translation from the academic world to the quote unquote real world is easier?
I think it's much easier. The kind of teaching that we do here, again, is you're adding to your existing file drawer. What I tend to hear from students is, and I'm amazed every time I hear it, and I've heard it, like, you taught me Core OB 20 years ago, and it's like one of the few classes I still go back to and look at some of the readings you gave us then about motivation. And it's still interesting today, and I still work with it, and I still use it every day in my classroom. I don't hear it was somehow irrelevant anyway. What I hear is I'm still using it, and I think, wow, it's quite a kind of humbling for a student to tell you that, 20 years later, they still refer back to some of the syllabus materials you gave them, a couple of decades ago. So, and that's what I think, business schools can sometimes get a bit of a reputation for being, because they're different. But actually, I'm a complete, total believer in the way we teach using cases for that reason, because it's applied. It also, but theoretically sound. I mean, it's research based, it's evidence based. It's that great combination of the two that makes it, useful, into the future.
Yeah, and it's so interesting that you're mentioning that even 20 years out, people are still drawing from what they learned in your class. And that brings me to, the second subject block that we wanted to discuss, right? Which is leadership in the real world and building a meaningful career, right? And I would be curious, can you talk a bit about common leadership traits that you can see in very successful executives and leaders of organizations? Is there maybe a list of 3 to 5 characteristics that you can see in a lot of those leaders?
Yeah, and indeed, that's what a big part of my research is on, and I talk about in our leadership class, which there are some things that are consistent across time, across culture, across kind of types of jobs. So some degree of what I would call extroversion. So your willingness to put yourself out, be a bit dominant, try to get things done, push. But also your willingness to engage interpersonally and socially with people. You can't be a bulldozer and get away with it. So you've got to be able to engage with people, but at the same time, be pressing your agenda. That's a kind of requirement to get very far in the world of, in the world of leadership, most anywhere. A second one is being conscientious. So having structure, organization, getting things, done, working through your list, having a strong sense of achievement. That doesn't mean if you struggle sometimes to, achieve everything on your list, that is somehow not going to happen. But it's having that desire to organize, structure, make things happen works across culture, across time, across job. And then the last one I'll highlight is probably related to our earlier conversation, is some sense of openness. So being open, curious, like, why does it work that way? People who are relatively low on that are good at kind of following instructions and getting things done. The people who are high on it can sometimes be perceived as a problem, right? Because they ask too many questions. But all the senior leaders I know, they get there because they've asked those questions. Why does it work that way? How come that, not that? And, well, wait a minute. Should I think about this problem in a different way? Certainly every entrepreneur I know is that way. But actually most of the senior exec people I know also have that kind of similar type of intellect. So I would say those 3 things are all, part of the package of a successful, business leader.
Yeah. And I think one of the most rewarding experiences from being in your class was to really analyze yourself and understand where your strength and where your weaknesses in areas like, for instance, openness or extroversion, conscientiousness. And I think in this context, we also discussed whether it is even possible to change some of those characteristics, or whether, we are born or influenced by our environment during our childhood, and it is actually very difficult to change some of those characteristics. Can you talk a bit about, do you believe that leadership can be learned, and how can some of those characteristics be changed?
Yes. So, obviously I believe leadership can be learned, or I wouldn't be teaching it. So the answer there is pretty straightforward. But of course, I'm not naive to the research evidence, which shows that personality is not something you change easily. You don't turn it on and turn it off. So the real answer is in working with who you are, leveraging the strengths, making sure that you find yourself in position that play to those strengths and that don't expose you to issues. So if all those things, if you have many of the characteristics I just described, but you're a little bit introverted and shy, then, there are workarounds. but you have to plan the workaround. So the workaround can be building a couple of really good relationships with people who are really sociable and who like to do that kind of thing. And they introduce you to people, and they make it easier because they introduce you as opposed to you having to reach out to network to other people. But plan the strategy. Don't just kind of think, well, I hope it will happen someday. And that's what this class is all about, is how do I think strategically about where my strengths lie, where there are issues, how to plan around that, and make sure that I've got everything I need in order to take it to the next level, to be successful. And I think that for me is the essence of how you teach leadership. I can teach you about great business leaders or great political leaders, and hope maybe you emulate some of it. But I actually think it really needs to be at your own level. Where are you now? And what are strategies you can use to take you to the next level?
Yeah. And you mentioned that one strategy, at least in the case of this extroversion personality trait, is to find people, if you're an introvert, to find people that are more extroverted. But I think is there also a danger in sort of finding people on the opposite side of the scale in some of those personality traits? I remember in class, I think we talked about the personality trait of openness to change. And you mentioned that it can actually lead to a lot of conflict if you're very open to change, to interact with somebody who is more narrow-minded, so to say.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Well remembered. On extroversion, opposites tend to work well together. Somebody likes to talk, somebody doesn't. I mean, that's just fine. But on openness, you approach the world either from the big picture, what's going on out there in the world, and you work down to some detail, versus low openness, which is start from the data and build yourself up. Interpersonal liking is an issue there. Now, as I said in class, if you can learn to work across type on that one, there's a lot of great benefits that can come from it. But, they're probably not going to be your best friend. And it takes a lot to build trust when I start, from a point of, I want to talk about anything and everything. And you start from the point of, I want to talk for the next, 3 hours about one thing. Very quickly I'll get bored. And then when I try to change the topic, you get offended. And, that's what I mean about those opposites don't work very well. You're absolutely right. But there are strengths of each. If you work together, good things can happen.
Yeah.
So, again, it's about strategizing. What do I need around me? What's going to help me get where I want to go?
Yeah, very interesting. And I think another question, and it somehow connects to those 5 dominant personal characteristics that people usually share, is do you believe that throughout your career transition, you need different character traits or personality types? So I can imagine that if you come right out of school, maybe, you don't need to be as extroverted as when you're the CEO of a big company or so. So can you see a certain change throughout a career progression?
Well, no doubt that as career changes and as career progresses, the demands of the situation change. So what works really well when you're an associate isn't necessarily going to be, what works when you're going to be a CEO, hopefully someday. And so again, it's about thinking, who am I? How do I fit with what's going on around me? What are the job demands going on around me? So, as you know, one of the final assignment is to say, where do I want to go in the next 2 years while I'm here on the MBA? What kind of job do I ultimately want to get? What are the job demands of that? And how does that fit with where I am right now? And then how do I get the two to work together? We ask you to do it as the ending point of that class, but it's actually a process you should keep going through throughout your career. If this is where I want to go, what are the demands? What skills do I need to show? What propensities do I need to show? What characteristics do I need to demonstrate in order for that job to look normal and natural for me?
Yeah. I have to say that one of the biggest takeaways from the MBA for me personally so far is the importance of writing down goals, right? And you refer to this plan, where do I want to be in 2 years, in 5 years, or in 10 years, and so on. And I think writing down goals apparently is extremely powerful. And I have never done it before, but since starting here at the London Business School, I'm doing it regularly. So I think it's just very, very, very important to be conscious about your decisions and really reflecting on where you want to be in 5 or 10 years and what are the skills that you need to be there in 5 or 10 years, right?
And to be flexible then in how you achieve it, because you'll have your goal, you'll have your plan. The one thing I know is it will never go perfectly to plan. Okay. It never does for any of us. But if you're headed in that direction, you maybe take a little detour, but you end up there.
Yeah.
Right. If you don't write it down, you take a little detour and before you know it, you're on the other side of town. And then how did I get here? This isn't what I wanted. That is sad. I hope that doesn't happen to you or to anyone else. But that's why, being explicit about where you ultimately want to be. So as you're taking the detour, to get back on headed in the right direction.
And I think that with every career goal, I think the consensus is it is basically impossible to reach it on your own, right? It's very, very important to form meaningful connections to not only your peers, but also your supervisors, and then at a later stage, the people that are working for you. And I think that brings me to, the last topic, which is around how do you build high-performing teams that are also diverse. And I know that you've done a lot of research on the impact of diversity in teams. Can you talk a bit about that? I think it's a very important topic, and over the past 2, 3, 4, 5 years, the issue of diversity has become even more important, and rightly so. So can you talk a bit about your specific research?
Sure, I love to do that.
Yes.
So I would say a couple things. First, having a great team around you, as you say, no one does it alone. I don't care, name any famous CEO, that everybody, household name CEO, and then there's this group of people around them who you don't know their names. Okay. I guarantee you there's a group of people around them, and people who don't necessarily like the limelight, but they want to do something important. And so it's building the right mix of people, the right mix of skills, the right group of people around you, and in general, building that team. But don't collect a group of stars. And this is really important. You need the right skills in the team. And if you only pick people who are well-known, there are 2 risks. One risk is you don't have the right skill set in the room. You got a lot of really smart people, but you don't have skill X that you really need. That's a problem. Or if they're all superstars and want the limelight in their own right, what happens is they all compete with each other and with you for a little bit of airtime. And you spend all your time internal fights rather than I'm perfectly happy to let you have the limelight, but I'm going to do this in the background. And I know I've made a difference, but I don't need to be famous. Those are the people, if you want to be famous, find the people who don't want to be and have the complementary skills.
Yeah.
Too many people don't figure that out until it's too late. And then secondly, and that's where the diversity conversation happens. You have to have diversity in order to get success. Diversity alone, though, doesn't do it. So the relationship between diversity and performance in teams is actually 0. Depressing finding at one level. And, there's, McKinsey 2015 says, categorically diversity has been shown to be helpful, for example. And there are others that may say that, but I can also show you all the other studies that show you the opposite. Overall, the really rigorous research gives you a nil effect. However, it's not that it doesn't matter. It's that combined with a great group process. Great, and diverse teams create diverse outcomes. The best team in the distribution is highly diverse, but so is the worst team. If you want kind of reliably so-so average results, homogeneous team will get you there. If you want world class, you want to be the best, you have to have diversity. And then the second part of the equation is you have to manage it, to manage it well. Don't diversify if you're not prepared to put the time and effort in to really work with that diverse group of people. And by working with them, I mean, each one of them needs to know why they're there. What's the relationship? And They need to believe that they belong in the team, and they need to understand what that role actually is. Too often we'll say, okay, well, I'd love a diverse group of people around me. You bring them in, and they don't know what they're particularly there to do. They leave. They turn around and go, like, I don't know why I'm here, so I've got no connection.
Yeah.
So people have to have that connection, and that needs to be a conversation, an explicit conversation around what they're doing. And obviously, they need to feel psychologically safe. They need to feel like they genuinely belong within the group. I would say great group process is understanding problems at the actual group process level. It's about understanding problems before trying to solve them as well. Mm-hmm. So everybody needs to feel safe. They can say what they really believe. Everybody needs to know what their role is, how they belong, and then understand the problem before you try to solve it.
Mm. And I think another challenge for diverse teams, and I'm to somehow speaking from my own experience as a diplomat working in very international teams. So I think one challenge is sometimes you're a bit lost in translation, right? So are there processes to manage the communication between team members, and what would you advise aspiring managers to do in this regard?
An excellent question. You've gone right to the core of what I would call the coordination problem. And it's not that people don't want to work with other people who are different. If you actually do the basic research, it shows most people are positive about the potential of diversity internationally, diversity, whatever. And then they get there and it's hard and you don't understand them and they don't understand you. And then that's the moment when you just think, you know what? Maybe these people are crazy. I don't know. And it's very easy then to just either turn off or to blame them for coming at the problem in a different way. I had no problem understanding my colleagues until this guy came along. And now this guy comes along and I don't understand what he's on about. And I don't understand it, so I don't know what to do with it. And so I reject them. But see, then you've completely defeated your purpose here and your point. So there are some good tools out there. And that's why I was saying, understand the problem before you reach solutions, because the first thing you've got to do is understand what they're saying and why they're saying it. And at the same token, you need to get across what your concern is and why you're saying that. If we both understand it, actually we can then problem solve it. Too often we go into a discussion like that and say, the German guy wants this, the American guy wants that. And actually, if we dug underneath and realized you're trying to solve one problem, I'm trying to solve a different one, we could actually agree. But, some groups are too lazy oftentimes to actually go through that process of trying to understand. And for goodness sakes, whatever you do, the killer trap is blaming the other side. I don't understand you. It's your problem. It's your fault. Well, wait, hold on. Maybe they are not terribly clear, but at the same time, I have a responsibility to ask, to understand, and figure out what's going on. When there's a misunderstanding, whose problem is it? It's both of ours. Groups love to assign responsibility for miscommunication to one individual. Yeah. It's a fallacy. It's wrong, because miscommunication means at minimum both sides have a problem. It's a group problem. It's not an individual problem. Don't make it an individual problem. And if you can really stick to that advice and not make it an individual problem, you're far more likely to get to a better place in a diverse team.
And I'm wondering, in such diverse teams, is it easier to resolve challenges of diversity if it is a team of peers where everybody's on the same level? Or is it easier if you have one clear hierarchical leader who can then maybe push for a certain process within the team to steer this diverse team into a certain direction?
Again, excellent question. What the research shows is that if you've got a good leader, leadership makes all the difference positively in the world. If you have bad leadership, it kills you. And it's a key part of this issue about you can't just diversify and, kind of as we're hope for the best. You have to have good leadership and process, in place for this to actually work. Leadership matters most, especially when things are problematic. So what it shows at the CEO level is that when economic times are difficult, companies are struggling, the quality of their leadership matters massively. When the economy's good, everything's doing all right, things are generally benign, quality of leadership, because everybody's boat's going to go up. How much does it go up? Quality of leadership isn't so central. And if you think about, what's happened over the last decade, there's a lot of kind of like, where are all the good leaders, the great leaders of the past? And it's like, you know what? Great leaders generally step up when you notice them when there's a crisis. And when there isn't a crisis, you don't, because it doesn't much matter. I don't want to misdirect here, but because the quality of leadership is a critical issue. But it's particularly critical when you have a diverse team. It's particularly critical when you have a problem, particularly critical when times are difficult. But yeah, it does matter. So I would say if there's a good leadership candidate and you're a diverse team, great, assign that leader. If not, on the other hand, as you know, and these guys will know, in most MBAs, you are assigned a leaderless team. And that's one of the big struggles of any MBA. It's a rite of passage. It's a torture by kind of experience. However, it's a really good learning experience. And so I was we have a board associates program where we're putting MBAs on boards of local charities. Just get used to the idea, learn about what board dynamics are like, running a significant charity. And boards are totally like those core teams. Everybody is independent. There's a nominal kind of leader, but not really. And everything you learn in that team is totally relevant when you step into a boardroom.
And I think there the importance of social psychology comes into play, right? So how do you influence team members without this formal hierarchy, right? So it's a challenge. And I was lucky enough to be in a great study group, so I don't want to complain, but I've heard from other fellow MBAs that they had a more challenging time getting along with their study group. But I think that's so great about business school, that it to some degree simulates real life, because as you mentioned, right, these are situations that you will face later in your career.
Yeah, and it's think of the MBA as one giant business simulation, before you launch off and do the real thing. Because that's what it is. We put you in those groups, which is very much a part of what you're going to have to do. You have an opportunity to do the student activities, which is, influence there is very much like influence at work. And it gives you just all kinds of opportunities to try things where the stakes are relatively low. I mean, if you screw it up, it's not that big a deal. But then if you experiment and you find something that's really good, like totally use that when you're walking out, into the world of work.
Yeah. Yeah, no, fascinating. And thank you so much, Professor Peterson, for the conversation. I think it was a great overview, not only about business school life, but then also about leadership education and how you can really use what you learn here in business school in real life, not only as the clear leader in an organization, but also in terms of building diverse and successful teams. Before we end the conversation, one question that I always ask our guests is whether they have book recommendations for our listeners. So do you maybe have 2 or 3 books that you found extremely helpful in your career that you would recommend aspiring MBAs or current MBA students to read?
I definitely do. The first book I always recommend is the Machiavelli's Advice to the Prince. It's an ancient book. It's 400 plus years old. And it talks about the politics, behind the scenes of, running a kingdom at the time, and advice for how to manage all that. You know what? It's great advice for corporate life today. And it remains great advice. I mean, it's ugly and it's going to make you uncomfortable at times. I just think, really? But yes, this is the negative side of human interaction. And even if you don't want to participate, you have to know about it. You have to know about it. The second book I would recommend is it's the other end. It's called Servant Leadership by Robert Greenleaf. It's what does leadership look like when it does, everything for the right reason, for good, And it's a really inspirational read. It's a classic, and I would highly recommend it to anyone who's aspiring to any kind of leadership role. Once we get beyond that, there are a whole range of really great books that I could recommend. Books like Team of Rivals, which is Abraham Lincoln's cabinet, and The Art of War by Sun Tzu, that give you kind of strategy and tactics and managing this team of rivals, a diverse team. And those are really good too. But I would say start with Machiavelli and then make yourself feel better by reading Servant Leadership by Greenleaf.
Yeah, that is great. Thank you so much. I'm sure that our listeners are also curious to learn more about your research. Is there any way that we can find you online, maybe on Twitter or LinkedIn or so, to learn more about your latest research?
Yes, I am online on Twitter, Dr. RS Peterson. I also have my personal website, randallspeterson.com. Everything I've ever published, every video I've ever made, everything available there, free of charge until the publishers catch up with me. And for anyone to take, if they find it useful, go for it.
Okay, thank you very much.
All right, thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Touch MBA podcast. Don't be shy. We have a mailing list. Go to touchmba.com and get yourself signed up. And we'll keep you posted with the best tips and insider interviews on how to get into your number one school. You can also find us on Twitter and Facebook at Touch MBA. See you soon.